Greenhouse people, I'm your host Bill Calkins, and in an effort to provide this critical information in any way you choose to consume it, we are pleased to offer this discussion in video and podcast formats. My guest today is a familiar face, Dr. Will Healy, who's a recently retired technical manager with Ball Seed, who's joining me once again to share protocols for finishing petunias this time as part of our Tech on Demand series covering key annuals and perennials commercially produced around the world. I don't need to explain how important petunias are for our industry. I'd put them on the Mount Rushmore of garden plants. But what I should explain is that there are different types of petunias, which most of you know. There's the seed types, kind of your basic seed, opening price point, good value for shoppers. There's vegetative, which come in all shapes and sizes and colors with ongoing breeding and novelties. There are singles, there are doubles. Then there's wave, which is your landscape type spreading petunia. And then, like I said, all sorts of novelties. And we're going to tackle these one at a time and what I'm going to consider a short mini series with Will on petunias. We're going to look at the basic seed, then we're going to look at the wave type, and then we're going to look at the vegetative. But like I said, petunias are on the Mount Rushmore and for good reason. They cover all colors of the rainbow. They're versatile for just about any use in landscapes, containers, baskets, and more. But maximizing sales and minimizing losses requires care and attention, especially as we look at each of these different types. And that's why Will is here. He's worked with growers around the world, producing millions and millions of petunias over his career. And I think he probably has the recipe for success. If you like this installment, be sure to watch the others in this mini-series on petunias and subscribe to the Tech on Demand podcast on your favorite app. You can find dozens of Tech on Demand videos on the Ball Seed YouTube channel. But Will, welcome back to Tech on Demand. How should our viewers and listeners approach finishing petunias from the perspective of these different types? And you're going to start with the basic seed type, right?
Right. Well, we'll start because that's kind of where everyone gets started in this business, is growing some seed petunias. There's a lot of commonality in the rules and the culture and what you should do and what you shouldn't do, insects and diseases. But each of these have some unique individual requirements or quirks or problems. And so what we're going to try to do is we'll talk about kind of the general stuff that we need to do for each of them, but then really hone in on the specifics for each of them so that you can try to get the best quality product in the shortest period of time. Because the great thing about petunias is that they basically give you the opportunity to turn crops rapidly. So if you get into a situation where you need more inventory, petunias are one of those crops, especially late in the season, where you can turn them rapidly and get that color out there that excites consumers. We want to get started. Why don't we talk about this common petunia, which of course has been around since, probably after World War II. There was three breeders that three people that got together. Charlie Weddell was the guy out in Colorado who introduced the first red petunia. Now, why is that significant? Because once you had red, it opened up a range of colors and types. And Charlie Weddell is, if you wanted to talk about the great-grandfather of petunia breeding, that's really the shoulder that all of this has been built upon over the last, what is it now, Bill? Probably if you take in the 40s to now. So let's just call it about 80
plus years.
Yeah. And so, and you can see the evolution of them. Bill mentioned the multiflora, the grandiflora, and there's a number of other types of seed petunias, but we're not going to get into the nuances of grandiflora, multiflora, other than, of course, grandifloras are big and multifloras are mini. But other than that, let's just talk about seed petunias. So let's go ahead and get started.
Sounds good.
Yep. So when we take a look at seed petunias, one of the things that we want to take a look at is let's make sure we get them planted immediately. Root binding that petunia plug is basically looking for nothing but trouble. Once they start wrapping around like we see in the picture on the left, those roots just really never go out very rapidly. So why is that important? Well, if the roots don't go out, they're not going to take up nutrition, so that you run into new nutrient problems. You don't get a real strong root growth, so that you don't have a root ball. So we really want to make sure that we don't hold those plugs, but get them planted right away. Remember, water them down to dry them down to a level 2 and water them back up to a level 4. How did you do that petunia plug on the left? Was really fairly easy to do if you just go in and piddle a little bit of water on them regularly so that only the top gets watered. Petunias are very notorious for this root wrapping if you don't dry the top down and water it back up, because they're kind of lazy roots in a sense. They're just laying around waiting for the root water, and if there's a lot of water, they don't need to go looking for it like the roots on the right. So if you need to hold them, they do tolerate cooler temperatures. In fact, it's better if you have to hold them at 40 to 55 degree nights, and keep that days down just to prevent them from stretching, especially later in the season when you got long days and they want to stretch. Now, we're going to just touch on an issue that we really have never talked about in any of these other crops too extensively, is floral induction. When does flowers first appear? Because later on in the crop, it's really important as far as the photoperiod and the leaf count. So we got an example of a plant where we've done the different leaf counts, and we've counted the leaves and marked them 1 through 8. And 7 and 8 basically are coming out and kind of standing almost straight up. Now, floral induction occurs after 6 leaves have unfolded. Okay, so that 6th leaf straight up is the 6th leaf. As soon as that 7th leaf comes up, you're now ready. And the night temperatures are greater than 65 degrees, and the photoperiod is greater than 10 hours. So if you basically bring your petunias in really early in the season, we talked about holding them at 40 degrees to 55 at night. But early in the season, if you don't have that leaf count, you may want to hold them at a higher temperature and under long days to make sure that you're planting induced plants. Because if you don't plant induced ones, flowering is really late. Time and again, we see on seed-raised petunias where people bring them in really early. Okay. They plant them because they've been growing them under dark, short day conditions where the photoperiod is 10 hours or less, and they're holding them really cool, and then they transplant them really cool, and then they wonder why they're not flowering until Mother's Day when they've had them sitting there since January or early February. It's all because they're just basically in a very juvenile phase where they're unfolding leaves. So we're kind of stress this point that when you bring them in and hold them, look at them, count your number of leaves, and then make a decision. Do we keep them warm because we want them to be induced when we plant them, or later in the season we run them cold because we already know that they've got the leaf count and they're going to be induced rapidly? So does that make sense, Bill, as far as how to handle them in the before transplant?
It does. Those are good guidelines for sure.
Okay, so let's talk about making sure you water your plugs in before planting with a fertilizer. Research that's been done by Bill Argo a number of years ago on begonias, but we've seen this in a lot of different crops. So if you put a pre-plant, and in this case we want 20-10-20. Why 20-10-20? Is it's got ammonia and phosphorus, and it gives you bigger leaves so that that pod or that pack is covered with foliage faster. And if you look at the pre-plant plus day 14, it's very similar to just using a pre-plant. And of course, the more fertilizer you end up putting on, the bigger the plants are, so therefore the more growth rate is. So a lot of times just getting that pre-plant on can many times be more than adequate to get the plants up going. 200, and then how much do you plant? If you're planting them immediately, water them in with 200 parts per million, because a wet plug going into soil that you don't saturate is much better, because that plug then has got the water, has got the feed, and then bam, it grows out. It almost acts like a spark plug, so it just pops out. If you're going to have to hold them for 3 or 4 days with no fertilizer because you just can't, consider putting on a little heavier feed, like 300 parts per million, into that plug before you plant it. And if you're holding it for 7+ days, You want to make sure that you're putting some, let's say 50, 75 parts per million just to prevent any kind of fertilizer stress. And then, of course, after the time of planting, get that 200 parts per million on them. The beauty of these common petunias is that you can put them in an incredible range of different sizes. So you can put them in pots, packs, baskets, you name it, they will perform. And that's what they're bred for. They're bred to perform, and that's what we really look for. What about the crop times on these? Well, the crop times, as you can see, are fairly rapid. And of course, it's all predicated on, are you planting a induced plug? Is that plug reproductive at the time that you go and you plant it? So make sure that you do have fully induced plants. And then, of course, the crop time, as a rule of thumb, the more plugs you have in a container, the shorter the crop time. So normally what we talk about is adding one extra plug will basically reduce the crop time by about 5 to 10 days, depending upon time of the year. What do we look for a media that we're using? Make sure that you're using a good 70% of it peat and then some other bulking agent, whether it's rice hulls, coconut fiber, wood fiber, whether it's composted wood, you name it, you can add to get your costs down. But if you've got to be careful that you don't end up with too much of this bulking filler material in there. And the reason is the water holding capacity is reduced as you reduce the amount of peat, so they dry out more faster at retail, and also they just don't hold the nutrition. And so the consumer success then stops. Make sure you always test your material before you start, and make sure that starting pH is 5 to 6. And the reason why we wanted that 5 to 6 is that petunias are very sensitive to high pH. Every year we get pictures from growers who have this kind of scenario where basically they've got plants that were all planted at the same time, but there's one group that they're not taking off, whereas all the plants around it are taken off perfectly. They can be from the same plug tray. They can be planted at the same time. Everything seems same, but the performance as you get out about 2 weeks is different. And the reason is that the media if old media is used, what you end up with is no starter charge is gone, the wetting agent is gone, so the plants don't have those critical components to get them to take off and grow. And then you end up with this kind of results. So make sure that you're always using fresh media when you go to plant your plugs. Now, let's just talk about building that successful petunia plant for your consumer. Remember, customers are looking at the tops and seeing that's what I'm going to base my buying decision on. Is there a nice foliage? Is it the right color? Are there flowers? But to achieve that, growers have to produce a solid root system. And the reason is you got to be able to take up the fertilizer to get the foliage going and get the foliage expansion. And you need to basically manage the moisture to get the roots. So we really have this combination of what growers need to do to manage that. So let's talk a little bit more about it. Now, I can't stress enough the axiom that fish grow in water, roots grow in air. And water management is key to success with petunias. When you basically hold them continuously wet so that they're always at a constant level 4. And remember what a level 4 is that a little bit of drip all the time. They basically maintain stretch and soft growth. Whereas if you basically run them way too dry so that they basically wilt, they're stunted, premature flowering, uneven performance. So you really need to make sure that you take them and dry them down to about a level 2 and check the bottoms of the container to see, are they a level 2, 3, and then the tops can be 2, and then basically bring them back up to water to a level 4. And as they mature, you can start going to a 5, but really make sure that you go up and down between a 4 and a 2. One of the things that we see every so often is growers who basically the plants wilt. And they wilt badly. And why is that? Well, it's a combination of either they failed to water the plugs in or the liners before transplant, really critical, or they didn't get the water in and around the root ball. And one of the problems that you run into is that when you plant some of these plugs, you end up with air gaps around the plug or liner. And to eliminate that, one of the little tricks that we know of is basically turn the nozzles so that they're at an angle. Notice how as the trays will go underneath this, there'll be some water coming from the forward, and then as it passes on by the water, it comes from the rear. So it kind of pushes the water up around the plug itself so that you end up with good soil contact with that young plant. Now, once you've got them planted, let's talk about water management. Now, when you're using very large containers, one of the things that you don't want to do is saturate that soil so that you've got a perched water table at the bottom. You want to make sure that it's a little bit dry on the bottom of the below the plug. You want to water enough so that where the plug is or where the liner is that you've got water, but below that, you want it to be a little drier so you can come back in and water again later. Because if you saturate below, it takes longer to dry out. So then they're basically trying to be fish and try to grow in saturated soil. The first watering, you basically want that level 3-4 at the bottom of the container. What you do is basically you get a drip. If you've got dripping, so it's just basically running water onto the floor or underneath the container, that's a level 5. You don't want to go there. Notice that when you take some plugs and look, or plants that have been transplanted, and you look at where they've maintained them in a level 5, a level 4, 3, 2, 1. Notice that the best root growth is when you basically are drying them down to a level 2 and also maintaining them about level 3. So that kind of wet dry so that there's air in that soil and not just saturate. Because if it's too dry, you don't get the root growth. And if it's too wet, level 4 and level 5 continuously, you don't get the root growth. So really be concentrated on that water management. And early in the season, it's really hard because the drying in the greenhouse is very, very slow. Cold weather, overcast weather, you're just not getting the wet dry cycling. So you have the urge to water. Don't. Let's talk about that pre-planned feed and make sure that you get that feed on early. Slow leaf expansion. Basically, if they're not filling out, put a little extra ammonia plus phosphorus on them. Sometimes you've got a fertilizer or a soil that's just not moving, or they may have been over a growth regulator, they're not moving. Use a little extra fertilizer to promote that leaf expansion. If you're seeing that you've got excess leaf expansion, eliminate after planting feeds. As you can see with this example, feeding at day 7, 14, and even on really is of no benefit, just makes them big and require growth regulators. If you have to feed, it's always better to put it on a little bit more often than to put on way too much and then you have to go after it with growth regulators. So 75 to 100 parts per million, 150 parts per million plus micronutrients is a good plan. One of the things that we like to see is make sure that you're feeding at the time you're shipping them out to retail with about 150 to 200 parts per million. That allows good retailability. Basically, they last and look good at retail longer, and also for the consumer success. So let's just talk a little bit about fertilizer. When you want to test your water annually to see what your alkalinity, 100, 200 parts per million is the ideal spot to be. Water nutrients. What is the nutrient level in that water? What is the pH and the EC? Because you need to use that to determine exactly what your fertilizer should be. The soil at the time of planting, that 5.8 to 6.2 is kind of the sweet spot. A little bit 5.5 is a good place to start before you transplant. But once you've transplanted and watered them in, it should come up to about 5.8 to 6.2 within a week. Let's talk about those early feeds and also the constant feed of 150 parts per million. If you're doing that, watch out for that high percent ammonia. Soft growth will occur. If you use a lot of ammonia plus phosphorus, you're going to end up with a lot of stretch, so you're going to have to use a lot of growth regulators. 20-10-20 versus 17-5-17 is really something you should be looking at. If we take a look at what happens as you add more ammonia and high phosphorus, the pH is going to drop in that soil. Whereas if you use a lot of nitrate in the fertilizer plus phosphorus, then you end up, in low phosphorus, you end up with a more basic soil and it tends to rise. Now, why that's a problem is you can end up with some nutrient issues that are kind of severe. So if we take a look at a couple of different formulations, 20-20-20, 20-10-20, 17-5-17, and then a bunch of the nitrate feeds of 15-5-15, 13-2, 15-0. One of the things that we quickly see is the percent of ammonia in each of these feeds. As you go from 20-20-20 all the way down to 15-0-15, you can see a significant reduction in the percent of ammonia. That's why a lot of people, as they're using to try to tone the crop, they'll go to 13-2-13. One of the things that you really have to watch out for in petunias, especially early in the season, is how much boron is being applied. Under low transpiration rates, so overcast weather, humid greenhouses, you're just not going to be moving a lot of boron because boron moves in the water stream. And so if you're not moving a lot of water through that plant, you're not going to move much boron. And many times we see this kind of symptoms in the picture where you basically have this hard, rocky, gnarly little plant next to a plant that's developing normally. And what's happened is that the boron level in that plant on the right is basically highly deficient, and it's a transient, so you can treat it. But notice that a lot of these fertilizers have very low. We normally like to see at least a half a part per million, 0.5 parts per million, and notice that you probably need to have a supplemental boron addition. So if you've got this problem with a lot of tip abortion in your petunias, do consider using additional boron. Let's talk about light intensity. These flower faster under higher light conditions. Low light, basically you can get stretch, internode stretch, poor flowering. High intensity will accelerate flowering. If you're using different LED lights, be aware of the fact that the light quality, red, blue, far red, can impact whether the plants will stretch and or flower. Now, on one hand, using a lot of far red light, in the picture example, this is some work that was done by the folks up in Michigan State. You use the far red light and you basically can really stretch these plants quite nicely. When you start looking at flowering, notice that far red light is promoting a flowering. So you do need to have, when you're trying to grow and finish the plants, having a little bit of far red is good, but having a lot can actually cause you some severe problems. So you really want to make sure that you, if you're looking at LED lighting as your light source for inducing these to flower, that you have the correct balance of red, blue, and far red. Remember, petunias are thermoperiodic long day plants. Now, this is a term that if you've been listening to any of our previous documents, we really haven't gotten into this thermophotoperiodic. The other crop that we've talked about in the past is the chrysanthemum, which is also thermophotoperiodic. What that means is that at certain temperatures that the plant is not responsive to photoperiod, whereas at higher temperatures they are. Now, remember, flowers are lateral. What that means is that there is a terminal shoot, but there's the lateral buds come out in the axil of the leaf. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, there is a juvenile stage. In the common petunias, it is about 6 unfolded. Now keep that in mind because when we talk about wave or the others, vegetative types, this is very different. So remember, you want to use the temperature and photoperiod combination to, say, bulk it. So if you're doing baskets or large containers, you may want to bulk that plant, delay flowering a little bit so you get more leaves, bigger plants. Whereas if you're trying to do packs and basically high density packs, like a 32 count, 36 count, you may want to have more rapid flowering. So you need to kind of understand where you are from a juvenility standpoint and induction because it'll determine the final plant size. If we take a look at this diagram, this table that I've created below, and look to see what happens at different stages. So if you have juvenile, which is less than 6 leaves, and a 10-hour plus photoperiod, which is a long day, right? But the temperatures are less than 65 degrees. If they're juvenile and they're 65 degrees or even higher, they're still vegetative. They have to unfold that critical number of leaves. If they have the 6 leaves, as we now see in the next row, and the photoperiod is less than 10 hours, and it's below 65 degrees, they're still vegetative. They're still unfolding leaves. If we basically then go add 10 plus hours of photoperiod, but they're still less than 65 degrees, they're basically remain vegetative. Now, if you basically do it correctly, which is 10-hour plus photoperiod plus 65 degree night temperatures, they will be induced to flower once you've got that 6 critical leaves. Now, the great thing is some of the newest varieties that are being introduced have reduced photoperiod temperature sensitivity, okay? But unfortunately, there's a lot of older varieties that has not been removed or bred out of the crop. So you have to kind of know your varieties and know how they're performing, and then kind of look to see which varieties will perform under my conditions. So that's the beauty of the seed petunias, is there's a lot of different varieties to choose from, so that you can find the ones that fit your particular environment. So if you've got problems where they're not all the colors in the series are flowering uniformly, look at to see how you're handling them from a temperature and photoperiod standpoint to get that correct balance that works for you. Now, once they're initiated, photoperiod doesn't matter. They're just going to do their thing. And of course, because it's a facultative long day plant, the vegetative growth is basically highlighted in the table below. Now, let's talk about the effective temperature. This is a cold-blooded plant, meaning that if the temperatures are 40 degrees or less at night, they're stop growing. That's the consideration of base temperature. So, and of course, soil temperature is really critical to this whole process, because that's where the meristem is, that's where the sensitivity is it's right down there by the soil. And as you can see in the days to flower from transplant, which was some work that was done by Eric Runkel and his team in Michigan State, you notice that the days to flower can drop significantly. So you basically have this very nice graph of days to flower. If we take a look at what the air temperature is, remember the air temperature promotes compact growth if you keep that on the low side. High air temperatures really do promote very rapid growth. And there is that interaction, as we mentioned previously, about the interaction between temperature and photoperiod. Let's talk about controlling stretch on these plants. Remember, excess fertilizer equals leaf expansion, big, soft plants. High ammonia plus phosphorus is give you leaf and stem expansion. Using that nitrate 13213, 14014, 15015 basically give you a more toned, compact growth. So you can use your fertilizer to really be one of the first tools in controlling your growth. And if you got a lot of excess growth, look at your fertilizer to see what's going. Remember, diff is critical, and it's one of your first lines of control. And of course, the day minus the night temperature is basically what will control whether the plant is prone to stretch or not. So if you got a very high day, say if it's 75, 80 degrees day, but you're running a very cool night, 60 degrees or less, you've got a very, very large diff, and you're going to stretch those, so you're going to have to use more growth regulators. So if you've got a high diff, you're going to use more growth regulator. If you've got using a lot of, say, 20-10-20, and you've got a lot of diff, you're going to really have to pound them with growth regulators to get them under control. So if you're seeing that you're working too hard and you're not achieving your goals, really sit down and pull those three factors in fertilizer, temperature, that dictate whether the growth regulator is the choice. And you don't have to have a complicated environmental controller to see what your temperatures are. Just use a high-low thermometer, record what the high is, record what the low is each day, and then just subtract them, and that kind of gives you a guidepost and a rule as to what's happening. What about growth regulators? Well, early season, we like to use dimenazide, chlormequat, either alone or in combination as tank mixes, or in Simidol. What that does is it just tones them down. It doesn't stop them in their place. As you get in later in the season where you've got a lot of high temperature, a lot of high diff, you basically need to go to baclobutazole or uniconazole for better control. Remember, early control should use sprays, drenches once you start realizing that you're approaching that 90% of the final height. It takes a couple of days for the paclobutazole to get into the plant, get to where it needs to be to stop growth. So you can't basically go out there and say, whoa, we're too tall, we're at the maximum allowable height. Well, you should have done that 3 to 5 days earlier. So really monitor your crop to make sure that you're on top of it and you're making that growth regulator decision early enough in the crop so that you have the high quality that you're looking at, because there's no chemical that will reverse stretching. So you've got to basically control the stretch. And there's a number of different growth regulators and rates. So let's just talk briefly about insects and diseases. And I can't tell you enough, check under the bench, check over the bench. Thrips are really in the pupa stage, basically are resting in the soil from last season, and as soon as you put plants in there and you water it and you warm it up, the pupa are going to come out, and you're going to have thrips all over the place if you didn't control them last season. So really look at what is the soil pupa stage, and you can check that by just watering your greenhouse ahead of time. Put some cards out, see if you get any emergence. Watch for mites, because they could be coming in from adjacent crops. Fungus gnats, short flies are always a problem because really bad. They'll sit there, the larvae will sit and eat the foliage and disfigure them. Aphids can be a drop-in late, especially late in the season. Let's talk about disease risk. Botrytis is probably your number one disease risk, especially as they get into flowering. So reduce the relative humidity at night through venting, airflow, all very critical to manage that botrytis risk. Look at your leaf spots. Usually if you got leaf spots, you've got hungry, wet, cold plants, so your culture is not on. The Phalaenopsis, which has a new name, which we won't try to pronounce, basically really look at your fungus gnat shorefly vectors, because what happens is the Phalaenopsis is in the ground, and the fungus gnats and shoreflies life stage has a in ground, and they basically get it on their little fingers and toes, and they wander up onto the plants and infect the soil from the soil below up into your finished plant. So if you've got a Phalaenopsis issue, really go after your fungus gnat and shorefly, because that's your vector. Watch out for crown and root rots, and that's, again, just not drying that soil, taking it down to level 2 and bringing it back up. So, Bill, there are some other resources that they can look to for more detailed information.
There are, and it sounds like the PGR guide from Grower Talks is going to be handy.
Yep.
If these crops start to stretch. I do also like how you talked about the specifics of flower induction, and that you do want to transplant an induced plug. Look for those 6 unfolded leaves, keep those night temps above 65 degrees in your photoperiod 10 plus hours, and then you should be on track, right?
Yep, exactly.
Cool. All right, back to the resources. Yeah, Grower Talks has grower guides on the website at growertalks.com/grower guides, and they've got you covered with insecticides, miticides, and fungicides, as well as biocontrols and biosolutions, and the PGR guides for annuals. All excellent resources available 24/7 at your fingertips on growertalks.com. And in addition, you can find hundreds of Tech on Demand educational resources online. Every week, I send a newsletter covering a range of cultural and technical topics. We've created hundreds of videos for greenhouse professionals of all skill levels. And as you see here, the Tech on Demand podcast is a great way to learn about technical topics on the go and connect with a huge global network of more than 6,000 of your peers by joining the Greenhouse Tech Team group on Facebook. All you got to do is search Greenhouse Tech Team groups and answer a couple simple questions. I'll let you right in. But Will, thank you so much for your time. I think you've given us a great rundown on the production of your more common or basic seed petunias, truly a backbone of any spring annuals program. You can turn them pretty quick, bring them into flower, sell them to just about any consumer, no matter where they want to put them in the garden, and they're going to be successful. So again, thank you so much for your time. I know we have a couple more petunia crops to cover here shortly, right?
Absolutely.
Sounds good. I'm Bill Calkins with Tech on Demand. On behalf of our entire team, thanks for listening and watching. Take care out there.